This is John from caveofprogramming.com. In this tutorial, it's the first in my Spring tutorial series. We're going to talk a bit about what Spring actually is. So this is a Spring program here. Spring is a technology that's typically associated with developing websites, very secure backends for websites. And also with working with databases, and it's often used in conjunction with something called Hibernate. It's also used for JMS, the Java Messaging Service, which I don't cover in this course, but probably the biggest two areas are websites and database programming. So Spring is just an API, so you just download a bunch of jar files and you use them in your program. And the idea is that you represent your Java objects by Spring beans, and these Spring beans are the kind of entities that are configured either typically in XML or else using annotations, and they represent your Java objects. And Spring allows you to wire together these beans in various ways. So you can create your Java classes and you can sort of code them as beans. You can specify that they are beans, and then you can use Spring to specify how those objects are going to interact with each other. So there's a bunch of different technologies that are typically used together with Spring. The website bit of Spring is known as Spring MVC, Model View Controller, which is kind of a strange non-descriptive name. The kind of downside of Spring, in a way, or one of the downsides, is that you have to learn a lot of Spring before you can get onto making web programs. So before I started making this course, I had the idea that it was really terrible that other courses spent a lot of time teaching you about basic Spring before going on to web applications. This is the typical structure of a Spring course. And I wanted to make a course that started with the web stuff, but unfortunately I realized it really wasn't possible, because you really do need to know a lot about Spring before you can get onto Spring MVC. So in this course I go through creating beans, and I talk about what beans are, and we use XML and annotations. Auto wiring is something that lets Spring kind of find the best matching beans for your particular need, and there's lots of other ways of wiring things together. With Spring, if you're not going to create a website, you might just use it for working with databases, and that's mainly because it supports Hibernate. It's really good for working with Hibernate. So you can use Spring with normal JDBC, which is kind of the default way of connecting to databases in Java, but more typically we use Spring with Hibernate, which is this technology that allows you to basically do away with SQL. So if you write a JDBC program that connects to a database in Java with or without Spring, the problem is that you have all these SQL queries which may be buggy, but you don't really know it, except by testing them and checking them. You can't really figure that out. Hibernate does away with that SQL, so you can just say to an object, I want to store this in the database, or I want to get stuff from the database and map it to this object. So Hibernate does object relational mapping, basically. And there are various other technologies as well, like Webflow, that are associated with Spring, and I cover a bit in this course. So the basic idea here is just that you've got a normal Java program, but it's got these beans that represent objects, and Spring specifies how to wire those beans together. And Spring also gives you a load of other kind of Spring modules that enable you to do particular things particularly easy. For example, the task of submitting a form on a website and then storing that into a database. Spring is set up to make that easy to do. And if you want to create a website that manages users, that's not so easy to do with just plain servlets and JSPs, which is what you might use to do Java web programming if you didn't use a framework. But Spring makes that particularly easy to do. It lets you set up a system for managing users really easily. So Spring it can be used with various core Java web technologies, but probably most often it's used as a way of managing JSP, Java Server Pages. So in this course I don't go into Java Server Pages, but I show you how to basically code them, but I don't go into any detail with them because that's a separate thing that you have to learn. But you can use Spring to organize those pages and to make the tasks that you normally do with those pages much easier. So it is easier once you've learned Spring. It's easier to create a website with Spring than without it. At least that's true if you're going to do a lot of stuff like submitting forms and storing that stuff in databases. People often ask if you can create websites like Facebook with Spring, and the answer is you can, but it's not ideal for that sort of thing. So I believe Facebook is written in PHP, and these websites that have things like instant messaging and do all kinds of fancy things, they're very, very heavy on JavaScript, which runs in the user's browser. Spring isn't about that. You can use those technologies with Spring, but you may find that something like PHP gives you easier facilities for working with JavaScript type technologies. And what Spring is really for is for creating secure backends. So creating the part of your website that runs on the server. It's a server-side technology, and it enables you to fully secure your website and to give particular users with particular privileges the right to do certain things on your site, and to protect your site from people who don't have those privileges being able to do those things. So Spring MVC is perhaps most often used by things like utility companies and banks rather than social media sites, although you could use it to create a social media site, but more commonly it's used for these really serious websites that have to be very secure. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to Spring. As I say, it is just a bunch of jars that you download, and those jars can then read XML, or they can work with annotations like this. But because there's so many different jars, even for a basic Spring program, you find yourself going to several different websites to download all the jars, and the versions of the jars have to match and so on. So for that reason, it's common to use, for example, Maven with Spring. And I kind of introduce you a little bit to Maven in this course, enough just to work with Spring. I don't understand Maven well myself. It's not something I've gone into. But the great thing about it is that you can just add Maven support to your project in Eclipse, let's say, and you can use it to download jars and to download any other jars that those jars need automatically. So Maven saves you a lot of time. It saves you from going to a lot of different websites, and it saves you not all, but some of the stress of trying to figure out which versions of jars are compatible with each other. So this course uses Eclipse. Eclipse is really great for programming Spring applications, whether they're web applications, or database, or whatever. And you can download the Spring IDE plugin for Eclipse, which gives you a lot of nice support for working with, for example, XML files. So I'm not sure if I have this set up properly at the moment, because I'm making this a long time after I actually created the course. But it gives you like a really nice interface so that you don't have to edit the XML by hand. You can edit it all through a special interface. So the idea is you can download and install Eclipse, and we'll go into that more in the next tutorial. And you can use that with some plugins to program Spring. If you want a version of Eclipse with all the plugins pre-installed, you can also use Spring Tool Suite, and this is STS, and this is just literally a version of Eclipse with all the plugins pre-installed, which is a very nice thing to have. I was a bit wary of it when I started this course because I hadn't used it before, but now I see that it really is just Eclipse with all the plugins pre-installed, so it's an easy way to get started with Spring. And it also provides you with some like template projects that let you set up basic Spring projects really quickly. But in this course I'll show you how to do everything by hand, just to get the best understanding of it. So if you're watching on YouTube, this is a big course I've made, and I've uploaded the first, like the initial videos to YouTube, so that's enough to get started with Spring. The whole course is not free because this is how I make my living, but if you want this course and you haven't got any spare cash, you can email me at john@caveofprogramming.com and I'll give you a free copy. If you do pay for it, I'm extremely grateful because it pays my rent. Okay, so in the next tutorial we'll look at setting up your system for Spring development. We'll look at what you have to download and install. We'll work with Eclipse and various plugins, Tomcat, and we'll use MySQL for our database. And all of these things are free, and I'll point you in the right direction towards setting them up, although you may have to Google for specific setup instructions for your system. So until next time, happy coding.